We're good.
All right. So we are doing a panel on brewing lagers, and we have Phil Nervoso, Ian Anderson, Ramsey Hogarth. We're going to talk about their experiences brewing lagers. So I have kind of a general outline here that we're going to go through, plus some of your questions you posted. So just to kind of start off, I want to jump around to our panelists and kind of get your kind of history, how long you've been brewing lagers, your favorite style to brew, but then also, if you were going to tell everybody here to go out and buy a commercial lager to drink, what would you be doing it? So Ian, you're the first on my screen, so you're up.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm Ian. I've been brewing for about 5 years, and I've been brewing lagers for about 3 years. So yeah, 3 years ago, I brewed a Helles because I thought it would be easy. And it probably wasn't good. I remember it being okay, but yeah, probably wasn't a good beer. Turns out that's a really hard style. Is this where I brag about myself?
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Why are you on the channel?
Yeah, so I brewed a Schwarzbier in 2018. And then I brewed a second batch of that, so a variation on that recipe, that won the 2018 New England Regional Homebrew Competition, Best of Show. So that was pretty cool. Wasn't expecting that, but that was pretty cool. That same year, I also brewed some Czech Pilsners and had kind of varying, I would say, not success with that. So that's kind of, I'll get to that, but that's kind of like my what I like to brew, and what I'd like to perfect is the Czech pale lager, Czech Pilsner. And then let's see, last year I got into fest beer brewing, and somehow my first batch of fest beer also won a best of show because I'm lucky, and that was in the Southern New England Regional Homebrew Competition. So that was in Connecticut. Totally surprised me, and thought it was a good beer, but yeah, pretty cool. So those are my bragging rights. And favorite commercial lager is probably this one. This is the Notch Desitka, which you might not be able to get now. I don't know if they have any more, but it's their 10th anniversary Czech pale lager. It's 4.2%, so it's a 10 Plato beer, session beer, triple decocted, which is ridiculous. Lagered forever, open fermented. But I would say, like, my favorite beer that I can get all the time is most all the time, is the Notch Standard Czech Pils, which is, I think it's a little bit stronger. I think it's like 4.5%. So it's a super strong beer. But yeah, it's just a super rich, like, delicious, big malt presence. Doesn't seem like it's a small session beer. Drinks like a bigger beer. It has a good, like, balance with the hop bitterness and flavor. So those are my overall deets.
And the standard is that a Czech Pilsner? Is that their American style lager?
It's a Czech Pils.
Yep. All right, Phil. History, favorite style to brew, and favorite commercial lager. You got to pick one of it though.
So I started brewing, I think 13 years ago, classic, got a homebrew kit. First batch turned out pretty well, and I stuck with it. I think I did my first lager about 10 years ago. I was brewing 15-gallon batches at that point. It was an IPL. It turned out pretty well, actually. Yeah, and since then, I can't brag as much as Ian can. I've won a bunch of medals for lagers, but I don't remember when or for what. Um, and now I pepper them into the brew schedule when I can. They're definitely a favorite of mine to brew and to drink. I love the challenge of brewing lagers. Favorite style to brew would be Helles, just because of its subtlety, its difficulty level. We'll get into why later, I guess. Favorite commercial lager to drink? Got to be this one right here. This is always in my fridge, Benedictiner Hell. Mainly because it's off flavor free, which is actually really kind of hard to find in the States. And it's $7 for a 4-pack of half liter. So that makes it pretty attractive. That's what I
Before
got.
moving on, I will say Phil did have, I think it was an IPL that he submitted. He kept rehopping and submitted to like 10 different comps and winning multiple of them. So don't sell that short, even though you don't remember them. But I remember that, and I think you submitted to IPA. I think you submitted in IPA and IPL categories.
Oh yeah, I won a best of show for that one. I put it in experimental. It was an experiment.
All right, cool. Ramsey, you're up, man.
Sure. So I started brewing in 2011, and I think I brewed my first lager in like 2013 or 2014. And it was the Schwartz beer recipe from Brewing Classic Styles. Came out pretty well. To me, it tasted a lot like Kastritzer. And since then, I've been brewing a lot of the smoked lagers, the Rauch beer, and smoked Helles in particular. Those have done pretty well in competition, especially last year when I think I won a best of show with a Rauch beer, and then got some other medals for those beers. My favorite lager to drink, I don't really like pick favorites, but I would say some of the top ones for me are the Ex Schlenkerla Rauch beer lagers. They're really good. I like the Jack's Abbey House lager quite a bit, and like anything from Notch is really good. They always make really good lagers.
Cool. So I think the way that we have this structured is we're just going to kind of walk through, all the elements of a brew day, from the ingredients and yeast to the brew day to the fermentation, to spunding and serving. So I think starting off with ingredients, I think we're just going to kind of go around the table here and just kind of talk about, so I think there's a bias where people think like, oh, I'm brewing a lager, I'm going to use Pilsner malt. Are you always using Pilsner? And then the other thing that I think is interesting, from something I was doing recently was like, all the hops that we use with, is there hops that work better with lagers, and are there hops from that you prefer to use, or hops that you use in ale yeast or ale brews that might not work over here? So I think just in general, when you're brewing a lager versus a ale, what are you thinking differently? So Ian, you want to kind of jump through there?
Sure. So always Pilsner malt is the first question. Yes. For me, I've never brewed a lager without Pilsner malt. I think I've only brewed about, I was just telling Phil, I think it's probably been maybe like 11 or 12 batches of lager. So it's not a whole lot of batches, but yeah, I've always had Pilsner as the base, even for the Schwartz beer. I think I do about half Pilsner malt for the Schwartz beer, and then a mixture of Munich and darker malt, like chocolate malt. So that's the malt base. Hops, I really like Spalt, or Spalt or Select, which I think is just a variation on it, but I think it's one of the like noble varieties. that is just like really spicy and has a good like herbal character to it. And I copy Notch a lot, so or try to. And I think they use Spalt in at least the Keller beer, the Zwickel, Notch Zwickel, I think is Spalt and Sterling. So I use Sterling a lot for bittering because it's a U.S. Derivation of Saaz. So Saaz is one of the OG noble hops as well. That's pretty classic for any lager style. But it's very low in alpha acid, so you have to use a lot of it to bitter, which is fine, but you just have to use more. So Sterling is a lot higher alpha acid. It's usually around like, maybe 8 or 9% as opposed to 2 or 3% for Saaz. So it's kind of more convenient to use Sterling for bittering or for flavor. So yeah, I use a lot of S hops, I guess, for lagers. Spalt, Saaz, Sterling. But yeah, I don't think I've actually ever used like modern, quote unquote, modern American hops for a lager yet. It's definitely on my, something that I want to try. But I really like the Jack's Abbey Galaxy Brow, which I think is all Galaxy hopped, and somehow it really works. I think because Galaxy has some of that like herbal character as well. It's got like the fruity and the kind of complex, kind of has everything going on. So like that could work well. Something to try. What else? Hops that I found don't work in lagers. I need to just try more things. Haven't found one that doesn't work, but I haven't really experimented too much either. So.
How about you, Phil?
So in terms of Pilsner malt as a base, I would say yes. I mean, if we're talking about German and Czech lagers, it's all about the malt. Hops are always going to play a secondary role. And so yeah, I would suggest that you want the finest quality Pilsner malt that you can get your hands on. Floor malted pills of Wireman or Bark. I think that's really important. Hops with lagers, I would first say that you want low co-humulone hops. That's kind of normal if you're using Pearl or Spalter or Hollister tradition for bittering, which I would suggest. You get better head retention. Co-humulone, it will knock out your head retention. Hops are foam positive when you use them as bittering, so you can undermine that by using American heavy-handed high bitterness, high AA hops. So I would suggest not skimping on that and just use the more expensive low alpha ones for that. Especially if you're like trying to make something beautiful, which I would suggest lagers. That's what they're all about. That like beautiful simplicity. Hops I wouldn't use. What I would avoid high co-humulone. I can never say that word right. Somebody correct me. I would avoid those as bittering hops. I wouldn't shy away from Citra, Galaxy, Mosaic, any of those hops if you're doing a hoppy lager. I would reserve it for the dry hop in particular. And I would pair it with certain yeasts that I think do well at lagering temperatures with those types of hops. They really bring out some unique characteristics.
Awesome, Ramsey. So obviously you brew a lot of the smoked lagers, so I think you're going to have a little bit different of a perspective here. But
Yeah. So, I mean, I think since I brew the German lager styles, you know, and particularly the smoked ones, like they always have at least some pills and then quite a bit of Munich or smoked malt as well. I would say, you know, like Phil, you want to get the highest quality Pils malt you can, and you also want to use like a German malts. Like, don't use American Munich or whatever for your German beers. Yeah, so I think, yeah, most of my lagers have had a lot of pills. I think I did brew you know, an IPL once that had American 2-row, but that was kind of the exception since I have only brewed that once and instead brew a lot of German style beers. As far as hops go, I've actually been bittering with Polaris, which is like a really high alpha acid German hop, and you know, I've been using just like a quarter of an ounce of it at the very beginning of the boil, and then after that, you know, using Saaz or Tettnang or Hallertauer towards the end of the boil. So I don't know if that has a lot of co-cumulone or what, but it's worked out reasonably well for me, and I haven't noticed any foaming problems on the beer that comes out after using that hop. Again, I'm not sure that there are any hops that are necessarily bad for lagers, but you know, I do try to use German hops in my German style beers, so try to get them, you know, from Germany. There may be some good American substitutes, but you know, I think it's a little more authentic if you do use the German or Czech hops.
all right, so I think this is the $3,000 question for everybody. Everybody's waiting for the answer. What yeast are you using? So we'll kind of mix it up now. So Rams, you get to start this time. So you're brewing a lager. What yeast are you pulling in to do it in? Why are you using it? Is there anything about that?
Yeah, so I think the first few lagers that I brewed, I used 3470. And the reason for that is because it's easy, right? Like, you just buy a couple packets of those and you have enough yeast for your lagers. You don't necessarily need to make a starter with it. As far as liquid yeast goes, you know, I've used the liquid yeast equivalent of 3470. You know, some Bach yeasts when I've been brewing Bachs or smoked Bach. I think the smoked Hellas's that I did well with were brewed with German lager yeast. I mean, why? Like, because the yeast come from Germany and they seem appropriate to the style. I'm not sure how much like variation there is in lager yeast. I think Phil could probably speak to that better, but you know, I basically stick with German lager yeast or the Bach yeast. And maybe this is jumping ahead, but with yeast, like in the lagers, I think you know, handling the yeast properly and making a huge starter and such are like very, very important. And oxygenating the wort first as well. So you want your yeast to be really happy. Sorry, Vince, I can't hear you.
Sorry, Phil, what's your go-to lager yeast?
So it's similar to Ramsey. I prefer the liquid White Labs 830, which is the equivalent for 3470 and whatever it is for white yeast. It's the Weinstefiner classic, clean lager yeast. The thing's a beast. It's really easy to manage. For me, it ferments clean. If you're managing it properly, it doesn't produce a tremendous amount of diacetyl or other off flavors if you're managing it properly. And again, I've done the Bach yeast for more, you know, for maltier German lagers. 833 would be the yeast of choice, White Labs. terms of a starter, I'm not sure it's possible to go too big. I
What's the biggest starter you've made for a lager?
6 liters.
Wow.
That's
So
like
how big a
that's
batch?
stepped up. That's just like a 12 Plato, 1048, 1050, whatever beer.
For how big of a batch was that?
5 gallons. If you read like the German brewing textbooks, they're pitching at like 20 to 30 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato, which for us, like a gigantic lager starter is like 2 million per milliliter per degree Plato. There's a huge difference. And they're mixing like some slurry from previous batches, like 60-40 to new fresh yeast that's been propped. It's they're making lagers and turning them in 17 to 20 days, which is absolutely fucking nuts. In terms of our standards, right? Like it's like 2-week ferment and then 6 weeks cold lagering. Like that's So I wouldn't shy away from making a huge starter if you're willing to. If you're ready to if you want to turn it much faster. If you want to.
So before we jump in, I had a quick, and other people just jump in when you have questions. So when you build a starter that's 6 liters, if I recall correctly, like about 1.5 gallons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you decanting that, or how is that like to 5 gallons? That's
So I decant completely every last drop of liquid, and then I'll take a thief and take some from the Wort, put it in there like a couple 100 milliliters, swirl it, put a magnet on the bottom to save my stir bar, and then I'll pitch it into the casting.
Phil, how necessary do you think that is to pitch such a huge starter? I mean, when I've made good tasting lagers, I don't think they were made with such a large starter.
I don't think it's necessary. I don't at all. I think you can take, which I'll leave it to Ian, the master of 3470. But I've done. He was kind enough to share his process with me, and I followed it to the T, and I made a fine Helles. Like it's totally good. I think what I would say is I just go back to what I first said, which is you can't pitch too big of a starter or slurry. You really can't.
Yeah.
You're going to get different effects. We're talking like degrees of improvement, like small percentages. There's all kinds of things that happen when a fermentation happens quickly that are better for the lager. Fewer precursors for diacetyl, fewer precursors for acetaldehyde, less DMS, shorter maturation time, all kinds of things. So where were we though?
I guess Phil gave us a little bit of a spoiler alert for Ian's yeast preferences, but
sorry.
Yeah. So no, it's good. So I've joked around that I'm considering getting a vanity plate of W3470.
move to New
I
Hampshire.
haven't-
Yeah. They're free there.
Yeah. So I love that yeast. It's so easy to use. I think I'm going to be the short and shoddy brewer because, for example, the fest beer that did well was just two packets of W3470 direct pitched no hydration, no starter. And that's a 1056 OG beer, so 6% beer. I thought it was good, but I will say the next one I did, the next fest beer I did was the exact same recipe, and it did not go as well. Like, it was fine, it was a good beer, but it wasn't like a great beer. So I think there's something to be said for consistency there. I think I'll probably just pitch an extra pack going forward. I'll just do 3 packs. But that was also no oxygenation, nothing. Which dry yeast is different. Purportedly, with dry yeast, it has stuff in it that helps the yeast not need as much oxygen somehow. I think it has to do with sterols and the cell walls. Phil is nodding. Save me. Something like that. Yeah, so I love that yeast. I have used, when I was trying to clone the Zwickel beer, Notch's Zwickel beer, I was tweeting Chris Loring, the Notch founder, asking for some tips, and he pretty much gave me a decent recipe of the malt bill, and said my hops were pretty in line. And then I said, oh, and W3470, because I know that he uses that for like the session fills and some of their beers. And he said, no, that's definitely not like malty enough for the Zwickel beer. So I will say that that's something like, I think W3470 gives you a really crisp finishing beer. And it has really high attenuation, like I get like 83% attenuation. So I have to mash really high. Like my Schwartz beer, I think it's like 157 Fahrenheit for 60 minutes, and it finishes at like 1014. So it's a pretty high finish, because I like some body to it. But yeah, you have to be careful with W3470 because you can get really low, like 1006 kind of beers that seem really kind of watery. So compensate with a mash temperature or carapils, malt, something like that. What else? So how big of a starter? 0 liters.
So you don't do a starter, but when you do a 5-gallon batch, you're pitching 2 or 3 packets, or what's the? It's like
Usually
6
2.
2.
Usually 2, yeah. So my Schwartz beer, I'll do 2, but I have done 3, and going forward, I'll probably just do 3, just because it's an extra $5. Get some insurance to make sure it's going to go well. But yeah, I mean, I think
I recently pitched 2, and it took about like 60 hours before really it kicked off. So
yeah, it does take a little while. If you're used to like a big, quick like ale fermentation, it's not like that. But what else was I going to say? I've also used going back to the Zwickel thing. So Chris said to use like a Bavarian style yeast for that, and I guess the W3470 is more of a. I think you can use it for like I mean, obviously you can use it for any lager, but it's on the like Pilsner side, I think, of where you'd want to use it, like traditionally. So I try to use what's it called? It's from Omega, and I think it's the Augustiner strain. But that gives a more kind of like malty impression on the finish, and retains more of the kind of rich malt flavor, and is attenuates less as well, so it gives you some more sweetness as well. So I've had good luck with that one too.
Awesome. So kind of moving on to brew day, and obviously we can't be here all night, so I'm just going to kind of like throw some of these questions out and let you guys kind of jump in I think DT had a really great question on the Slack of, when you're getting ready to brew a lager, are there things like, are there specific things for water adjustments that you need to be aware of versus ales, or is it going to be very based on the style you're hitting? I think Phil, this is something you probably think about a lot, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say
You want to clarify your question more? That's fine too.
Oh, that's right. I mean, with ales, we don't usually hit like, oh, this is my ale water adjustments. This is my IPA adjustment. This is my stout adjustment. Blah blah blah. Is it the same? Do you follow the same regiment for your lagers? So if it's a Zickel, you have one water style. If it's a Czech pills different than the German pills, so on and so on. Or is it kind of like, like we're using pretty much the same yeast, slightly different grain bill. We're going to use pretty much the same water adjustment across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both style dependent. Yeah, I mean, so if you simplify it down to like sulfate versus chloride, right? Like which one's going to accentuate the character of the style of the beer that you want? I think overall, I try to keep the salts as light as possible, because it's generally a lager. You want it to be as clean, and you want everything else to get out of the way so the malt can shine. But if you want to make something that's more rounded, more malty, then you're going to boost the chloride slightly. And if you're making an alt beer, you probably want a little more sulfate in there to boost that hop character. Right? But overall, I think my main message would be keep it simple, keep it light, especially if you're making a light lager of some sort.
Yeah, Ramsey, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I keep it simple as well. I use Medford water, a little bit of phosphoric acid to get the mash pH right, and a bit of calcium chloride in the mash as well. If I were going to do like a Czech or German pills, I think I would worry about the water a little bit more, because I think that apparently the water has a more important role in those styles. But otherwise, I just use the phosphoric acid and calcium chloride.
So Ian, you make those Czech.
Yeah, I try to make the Czech beers, but haven't done super well. But when I do, yeah, I would just basically use the Boston soft water with some what do you call it? The stuff to get the chloramine out. What do you call that?
Campden.
Yes. Yeah, basically
Yeah,
just
I do that.
and,
I do that too.
And acid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep, that's it.
All right, so moving on the brew day. So, Ross is in here, so we're gonna lose this. I don't know. Maybe you guys. Is there anybody here that's like, do you decoct? Are you doing just single infusion mash? Are you step mashing? Like, what's the? I think there's like this, the German brewers do. Notch does all the decoction. What's the? What are people doing here? Jump.
I mean, I've done it all, from triple decoction days to for the most part just single infusion, with a mash rest, a mash out rest. I think it depends on what you want to achieve, right? Like, and your malt bill. If you have the time and the means and the energy and you're excited about decocting, go for it. It's awesome. It's really fun to do, and it makes for a really interesting brew day. You got nothing to lose. We're just making beer that we like to drink for fun for the most part. You can sub in some Illinoisen if you want to try that too, and compare that to if you're going to decoct.
What do you think the difference between decoction and just subbing a melanoid in it?
I do. I don't have any empirical like evidence of that, but I think that when you put it on the can, I think Notch is a great example of that. It just tastes better when they say they've decocted it 3 times. You know, it just your taste buds respect that more, I think, for some reason. Um, but yeah, I would add like one trick I do when I'm decocting is like, so like you're gonna take a, you know, really thick part of the mash, like, you know, there's plenty of information online about how to decoct, but what I like to use is my induction burner as like an auxiliary heat source next to the brew kettle, so I can kind of manage both and stir at the same time. It's gentle on the grains, like you're not going to get scorching, which can sometimes happen if you're using a propane burner. So if you have an induction burner, it's a nice little trick.
Anybody else doing anything different than a normal single infusion mash?
I've experimented with decoction a couple times, and then, you know, direct heated step mashes, and like, I'm not sure they make a huge difference. I think they can drive the attenuation down, which is good in your lagers, but I'm not sure I've been able to like do the step mashes and get the temperatures right. It's just, for whatever reason, difficult for me. Most of the time it's like a single infusion step mash, single infusion mash with a mash out for me. I have been wanting to try this technique that was mentioned in a Zymergy article a few months ago, maybe, that was like, you take half the grain and half the mash water, and you mash, and then you basically boil the half the mash, and then you take you know, the other half of the grains in the water and put it back in to get it back down to like, you know, 150 or 155 or so. So you can kind of like do this false decoction. Sounds like an interesting technique, but mostly it's been single infusion mashes.
This is just where I keep giving Notch tips, but Chris said that they do a fake decoction, quote unquote fake decoction, for the Sokol beer, which I think he said he described it as basically just decocting up to mash out, kind of. Yeah. So you're still boiling a portion of the grain, but you're not getting, you know, a super long brew day on top of that. But yeah, as far as me, just single infusion mash rests, and Ross and I tried to do, or we did do a single decoction on a collab beer, and we messed up that beer in like 3 other ways. So, which is generally kind of how I feel about homebrewing. Like, you know, I don't feel like I'm at the level to get the benefits from decocting. Like, I feel like once everything else is perfect, then maybe you can, like, you know, get the subtle changes from decoction. But until then, like, I'll probably screw something else up. So I might as well just do the easy, simple thing and hope for the best.
So some of the other things on brew days, you know, I think, you know, just kind of going quick around there is, are we always doing 90-minute boils? You know, it's like a quick yes or no. And then obviously, like, what temperature are you chilling down to? And is there like a tip for getting it that low?
Yeah, so I've been doing 90-minute boils on all or most of my lagers. Chilling it, what I do is I usually chill it down to like you know, 60 or 70 degrees, maybe a little bit higher depending on the weather, and then I'll rack it to the carboy at that point, and then take it down into the fridge and just chill it in the fridge overnight before I pitch the yeast. So I usually you know, wait for the fridge to chill it to about 45 degrees, and that's when I pitch. But it takes overnight.
No.
Yeah. What was the first question again?
So basically, like, are you boiling 90 minutes?
Oh,
That's
right.
yes or no. And then like what do you chill to, and like what is your tips for chilling that low?
Gotcha. No, I'm not boiling for 90 minutes. I do a 60-minute boil generally. I'm pretty sensitive to DMS, and I haven't had issues with that. I'm not sure it's necessary. That's not what the Germans are doing. They do like 50 to 60-minute boils. So if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. And then in terms of chilling, wintertime is your friend, obviously. And then to get to, like, if you want to do a summer brew and pitch right away, I'll use my little plate chiller hooked up like in a circuit with a bucket full of ice and a immersion chiller. So cold water's running through the plate chiller, and then it's pumping through through an immersion chiller that's in an ice bath, and then going back into the kettle until I can get it down to where it needs to be, which is like really cold, 50 degrees.
Pretty much the same here. I do 60-minute boils. I do 75 when I'm feeling, I don't know, adventurous. But yeah, and then for chilling, you probably see a pattern here. I only chill down to, I don't know, high 50s, maybe 60s if I'm feeling lazy, and then just pitch because why not? Couple esters in there, it's fine. It's fine. All good.
Once you get to fermentation, like what is our, so you kind of all said your pitching temperature. What's your, this is something I was struggling with. What's your temperature schedule, and then like how long is this going for? Ian, you're the short and shoddy. You can start.
Okay. Yep. So I'll pitch ideally mid 50s to high 50s, and I will, since that's like warmer than what a lot of people do, it'll basically be, getting pretty much done after 3, 4, 5 days, or at least halfway done. At which point I will start to ramp up, a few degrees a day until I'm in the like mid 60s. And then I like to do like a long, like 5-ish day rest there. Since my whole schedule is pretty short anyway, I'm like, I might as well just let it clean up at the warm temperatures there for a little longer. And also because I don't really believe in lagering. So I'm just like, just keep it warm and let it condition when it's warm, because yeast is more active when it's warm. And then I am usually pretty careful to only go down a few degrees per day when I'm ramping down to lagering or conditioning phase. But yeah, it's pretty short schedule for me. It's about 2 weeks usually, and then I'm spunding and carbonating.
Ramsey, you want to go?
Sure. So I usually end up pitching my beer when it's about 45 degrees. I always oxygenate it with an oxygen wand for like 60 to 90 seconds first before pitching the decanted starter. And then at that point, I'll let it just kind of rise to 50 degrees, keep it there for about a week and a half to 2 weeks, and then ramp it up to like 65 gradually for a diacetyl rest. I'll let that go on for 3 or 4 days. And at that point, cool it down to 35 degrees. When it's been there for a day or two, I'll rack it to the keg and force carbonate it, and then lager it for like a month. So I'm I guess a bit more like long and slow for the process.
So how
Yeah, so I'll in ideal conditions, I'll chill it down to, just a couple degrees below fermentation temperature, so like 46, and then I'll pitch, DT, I think I just saw your question about like room temperature starters, or like ferment. So I'll make sure that the pitch is always the same temp as the fermentation, or what I'm pitching into, or a couple degrees below. So yeah. Once it's pitched, I'll oxygenate and then let it ride until I see active fermentation, which if you pitch a big enough starter, you're seeing activity like, the next morning. And, fermentation usually takes like 4 to 5 days. At that point, things start slowing down. And once we're getting to that phase, I'll bump it up slowly to like 55. In an ideal scenario, I won't go any higher than that. There are negative effects of going higher, like increased EMS, less head retention. There's a few other things I can't remember at the top of my head. But there's a reason why they ferment low and pitch huge. It's because there's bad things that happen when you start to ramp up too high. We're talking like, trying to make the world's perfect lager. Yeah. And then maturation. I'll slowly, like a couple degrees a day, like 3 to 4 degrees a day, bring it down to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and then let it rest there for a couple weeks. It's about all you need for it to clarify. And then you got to manage sulfur, but that's a whole nother story.
So I think the clarifying is good. So I think there was like 2 questions about the like kind of expediting this process. So one of them, I think DT posted, was, is anybody like relying on or has used a clarifying agent, whether that be gelatin or, there's a couple more out there. And then the other one that like I posted was about if anybody has any experience, or are we just going to completely avoid I think it's like the Mike McDole like quick lager method. So I think this is just like whichever one, anybody has any experience with any of these, just jump.
I just use Irish moss at the end of the boil, and then to avoid getting a lot of yeast and trub in the serving keg, I chill the carboy down when it's done fermenting to 35 degrees, and then let it sit there for a couple days, and then rack it to the keg. And at that point, it's already pretty clear for me. But I've never used gelatin.
Well, you're a vegetarian, so I guess you wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. No animal products.
Yeah, I'm all for fish platters, right? Isn't that what it is? Carnesian, right? Carnesian. Yeah, I'll throw a tab of that in at the end of the boil. But after that, it's just time. A couple weeks and it'll clarify.
Yeah, same for me. Except I just start drinking it when it's not clear yet because I'm impatient.
All right, so I know Ian and Phil are spunding. I guess one thing's like, what, like for a lager, do you think there's a vast advantage to spunding one of these versus like waiting for it to finish and pulling it in? Ramsey might be spunding too. I just don't.
No, I've never spunded.
All right, this is where I get picky, and I'm a big fan of spunding, and I would say, yeah, the way I think about it, I think is maybe somewhat different from maybe some of the traditional reasons why you would spun, but I basically stole this idea from Phil for brewing New England IPAs to reduce the effect of oxygen. So I feel like that's like the best way to not have any cold side oxidation is to transfer your beer to the serving keg before it's done fermenting. So it still has, 5 or 6 points of gravity left to ferment. At which point you then put the spunding valve on the serving keg, crank it up, and then just let it go to, 20, 25 psi, or more, depending on how warm you have it, to get a solid like 2.5 volumes of carbonation. Yeah, and that way the beer is always active. Like when you're transferring, you're never transferring beer that's just doesn't have any active yeast that's protecting it. It's kind of the idea. And I have found a big flavor difference in my lagers from doing that. Just like it preserves the like fresh like malt quality, I feel like.
Phil, anything to add on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent of spunding. Who doesn't like free CO2, right? It's good for the planet too, right? Like all we're doing is like pumping out, greenhouse gases. If we capture some of that, right, it's less that has to be used. And I would say anybody who wants to try spunding, if you're going to build your own spunding valve, I would highly recommend having a gas tube or gas line coming off of it, between your quick connect and your spunding valve, and then put a little bit of sanitizer in there, and it's a really nice visual information about the activity, the fermentation activity in your vessel. That's assuming.
So you're saying not having like the spunding like tea coming right off the valve, right? You're saying like having a tube?
Yep, having a tube, and this is assuming you're using a keg for primary fermentation. Yeah, it's really, really helpful. It gives you so much. It gives me a lot of visual information.
What do you see in there? Like I've never done
the speed of fermentation. So like you can get a sense of like, oh, things are really ramping up right now, or things are slowing down, or I'm not seeing anything. What the hell is going on? So,
but if the spunding valve is closed, why do you still see like motion, like bubbles in the sanitizer?
Oh, I'm sorry. So yeah, good question. So I put a spunding valve on at the start of fermentation when I'm fermenting in a keg, and I'll set it to, I don't know, 3 to 5 psi, just to give it a little bit of back pressure. At our scale, oxidation is just murderous. It kills beer. So that really helps a little bit of back pressure.
So one thing you guys mentioned was like starting to spund when there's like 5 or 6 gravity points left. How are you figuring that out?
So I ferment in kegs. So I'll have the fermenting keg hooked up to a gas jumper line. So the gas in post on the fermenting keg, and this is a Phil thing as well. The gas in post has a gas line going to the eventual serving keg on the liquid in post. So the CO2 is flowing through the bottom of the serving keg, and the spunding valve is on the serving keg, gas in. Yeah. Why did I just tell you that? What was the question?
How are you figuring out when it's time to start spunding?
Right. Okay. So I also have the spunding valve on during fermentation to set to like 5 psi, so that I can put a little ball valve tap on the fermenting keg to take samples. So I'll just take a little sample throughout fermentation and check refractometer and to get a gauge. It doesn't have to be exact. I would say overshoot a little bit. Like if it's 8 points from done, I'll just transfer it then, because you're spunding like you can set the pressure. It's not gonna overcarb because you have the spunding valve.
Is that second keg just to catch any krausen that might blow out and you don't want to like clog up your spunding valve? Like what would the point be other than just putting the spunding valve right on the gas out of the fermenting keg?
Aren't you like trying to clear the other keg of like using the CO2 to push?
Yep, it's the best way to purge the serving keg because it's how much CO2 is produced during fermentation, Phil? It's like 1 billion trillion pounds. It's like a crazy amount of CO2.
I think the exact number's a lot.
Some people actually fill the second keg up with star sand and then push that out into a bucket. So and they have enough to push an entire keg of star sand out in usually the first 24 hours.
Yeah, 30 times over at least, right? Like there's a tremendous amount of CO2 being produced. So that purges the serving vessel of any oxygen, for free, basically, and at a really pure level.
Cool. So I think the last thing, covering here in the last couple of minutes is just, there's some general troubleshooting of, dealing with, I think we already covered, things take long to develop a krausen, and it's just pitch higher or be more patient. But, I think the things is, when your lager smells like rotten eggs during fermentation, or I think the ultimate is, my beer tastes like butter. What do I do? And Phil probably was going to say dump there, but if there's any solutions there.
Yeah, so one of the big advantages I see in fermenting in kegs and serving in kegs is that if you end up with if for some reason you did a VDK rest and it passed, and then you later discover that you fucked up and it actually is full of diacetyl, you can then take your keg, warm it up, turn it upside down a few times, get those yeast moving, and you're gonna solve that problem most likely. I don't have a big problem with diacetyl because I do such large pitches, but one time it did happen, and that's what I did, and it worked really well.
Yeah, I know people have had varying success with repitching like a new starter into your beer. Just get another big starter going. If you have diacetyl in your beer, and you can pitch that again, and wait. I don't know if you need to wait a whole another like couple weeks or just 1 week or something, but that should also clean it up theoretically.
Yeah, I've had moderate success with that in a diacetyl lager. But like Phil, I think the best solution is to manage your yeast and fermentation properly to avoid diacetyl in the first place.
Yeah.
Although absolutely. I will say that all my lagers, like during fermentation, they smell worse than my ales, and that might be because I lager them in a chest freezer where it's like all the stuff is like concentrated in a small space, but they always stink, even though they turn out reasonably well at the end.
I would add that like anybody, if you're struggling with diacetyl, do a VDK rest. Vicinal.
Can you walk us through that, Phil?
Sure. So when you think you're ready to transfer to a serving vessel, take a sample, put it in a container, cover it with like tinfoil, and then put it in a warm water bath until you can get it to like 140 to 160. Hold it there for like 20 minutes, and then uncover it and give it a whiff, a few. And if it's gonna not smell great, just to begin with, but if it smells like diacetyl, if it smells like buttery, if it smells any kind of funky, give it some more time in the fermentation vessel, and or bump up your temperatures. Not much to it.
Feels bad. All right, guys. So before we close out, or before we start like opening up for general questions, is there any just advice for people being like, I want to brew a lager this weekend? You know, are they too late to start their starter? What is your closing advice?
Yeah, I'd say you're probably too late to start a starter. If it were me, my biggest advice, like, get a chest freezer with a temperature controller, get an oxygenation wand, and get a big Erlenmeyer flask with a stir plate. Because I think temperature control, yeast management are the most important things for a lager.
Speaking of which, Phil, where the fuck did you start a 6-liter starter in?
Where did I get that?
I have a 5-liter flask. But like, where'd you do a 6-liter starter in?
So it's like, lab grade starter, like Erlenmeyer flasks. I have 2 of them donated.
It was like 10 liters.
They're 6. They're 6-liter starters. They're 6-liter flasks. They don't krausen that much, so you can fill them all the way up, generally speaking.
All right, I wanted to come back to this question because it's not too late. You have plenty of time. Buy 3 packs of dry yeast. Throw it in. Boom. Lager.
Yeah. You know what you could do too is, this is a good idea anyway, is just to have a few packs of dry yeast in your fridge at all times in case you have some kind of equipment malfunction or your starter doesn't take off or whatever it might be. Just have that lying around. That way you can, cover yourself if something goes wrong with your starter.
I would just add like advice for people who want to make a lager, like basically what Ramsey said. Make sure you have fermentation control in terms of temperature, but also just like don't be afraid to make a lager. They're not that different than anything else you've made. It's probably going to be bad. Just know that the first one you make is probably going to be bad, and that's okay.
I would also say maybe.
Sorry.
I was just going to say start with a non-pale lager, maybe like a Schwarzbier, or like a Dunkel even. Just something with some other flavors to, maybe mask some of the other issues with the beer.
Yeah, and to that point, like, try your best to come up with a consistent brewing process as a baseline so that you can then troubleshoot moving forward and figure out what you need to do differently.
There's one other question in the Slack that I forgot to cover. So I know everybody mentioned, a few people mentioned like the slowly ramping up and ramping down of temperature. Is there how do you think, how important is that? So rather than just being like, I'm going to set my temperature for 32 now versus I'm going to set it for 60, like, what's the value of saying, doing it a degree a day?
I would argue that there is value, that the yeast are going to express less when they're not going through some kind of temperature shock. They're going to be they're going to be able to acclimate better if the ramp down is slower. They're going to clean up faster if the ramp is slower. That being said, you can do it without it and it's going to be fine. Might just take a little longer.
Yeah, building off that same idea, I like to not use a thermowell personally. So I measure my temperature in my chamber outside the beer, which is controversial and a little tricky. But what I like about that is that I just set the temperature control. I'm setting the ambient temperature, which is a much gentler cool down, for example, compared to if the thermo well is in the beer, it's going to take, a long time to, or a lot of chilling to make that beer temperature actually go down. So by just changing the ambient temperature, it's just a more gradual, theoretically easier on the yeast that way.
Yeah, I agree with Phil that there's probably value in changing the temperature pretty slowly. What I do is I have a temperature probe that, I like wrap it in kind of like a paper towel or so, and then tape it to the side of the carboy. The one exception I think is that it's probably okay if like the beer, once it's all cleared up and everything, and you've done your diacetyl rest and whatever, and it's like tasting good, I think at that point you can probably be a little more aggressive with chilling it down. But before that, you want to ramp everything.
All right, I think we covered everything that's been pre-planned. So I guess before DT stops the recording, we have a couple beers. Is there any other questions anybody has about lagering or anything for the committee?
I have a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go for it, man. I'm on Pete.
All right. For those that have mentioned spunding, I don't have any form of temperature control. My basement hovers around 55. If I ferment in a keg with my spunding valve at about 1 bar, I have WLP 925, which is a high pressure lager yeast supposedly. That supposedly you can do a lager in 3 weeks with. Has anybody have any experience with that?
Haven't, but I would say that as the pressure increases, you can increase the temperature without the fear of many of the ill effects of increased temperature on lagers.
Okay.
No buffer.
Is there another, well, I guess this is why you might have a special yeast for this, but I was going to say the other side of that though is that, more pressure is more stress on the yeast as well, right? So do you want to make sure that the pitch is big and healthy? It's kind of the other side of that coin.
Yeah, like don't ferment at like 20 psi because you're gonna kill yeast. It's got to be like you can get away with like 12 if you have a big enough pitch.
According to the label on the WLP 925, they say 1 bar, which is like 14.8 psi, so I'd say 15. But I don't know if it's ever used it before, and but I don't have exciting temperature control, so.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you could do is just get some kind of container, the old school, like put water in it, and then drape a towel like in the water, dip it in the water like a wick, so it sort of cools at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
They say that 3470 is supposed to be pretty forgiving with respect to temperature. At least that's what the guy from the manufacturer said at the Homebrew Con last year.
Even on the packet, it says, I think it's like 55, or I think it's actually 58. The recommended range is like 58 to 71 or something. Yeah. It's like, it's crazy. It's like,
that's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. Like American commercial breweries are using that at like 60 to 65.
So that's what I'm saying. Just read the label. It's fine. Makes great lager.
Is fermenting under pressure like an Instapot? Like things just happen faster? Does it ferment faster?
Slower unless you have a huge pitch. But it will reduce esters and kind of make up for the fact that, like, so when you increase the temperature, you're going to reduce sulfur production and you're going to reduce sulfur production and increase esters, and that fermenting under pressure kind of has the opposite effect.
So just to chime in real quick on the pressure thing, I know it doesn't really matter on the homebrew scale, but hydrostatic pressure is kind of a big thing on the professional scale. And, a lot of professional breweries will still ferment lagers in vertical conicals. I know that we do. And it doesn't take that tall of a tank for that hydrostatic pressure to get well above 20 psi. So, while you're saying 20 psi might be kind of a limit for some of these yeast where it gets dangerous, it's pretty commonly used in professional settings.
I'd like to go back to the earlier question about temperature control. And have any of you at some point gotten to the situation where you don't have enough room and just fermented at ambient temperature? So let's say the ambient temperature is at 60 or 65. If you've done that, have you seen any kind of difference in the lager that you got out of there versus doing it at, let's say, 45 or whatever?
I only have
No,
a couple data points on that, but you'll probably know that I'm like, it's fine. But that is specific. I will say that's yeast specific. I think there are a lot of strains that don't handle that as well and will give you a lot more esters in the 60s. But yeah, like I said, W3470, like on the label, it's like, sure, go to 72, like whatever. Brewlosophy takes it to like 95, and like, it tastes great. Which is that might be a little much, but 60s, yeah.
Yeah, I've never done that and probably don't recommend it. I think you're taking an unnecessary risk. I think lagers, like you do have to have a little more equipment and temperature control to do them consistently well. And, you just have to plan how much space you have in your fridge or chest freezer for these things.
Yeah,
Different
yeah.
question.
I don't have much to say about it.
So there's a question we had, which was, and I don't think so, but has anybody here used Oslo as a stand-in Quebec, whatever the fuck it is, for lagering?
Nope, not me.
No, because then it wouldn't be a lager.
That's true.
Also, so that was another good question on the Slack that Garrett posted was, is any beer that is kegged a lager?
Yes.
I was just kind of being an ass, but thank you for bringing it up.
Wouldn't that just
Are
be
you getting
lagerine?
Are you getting into the semantics of lager meaning like to store in German? Is that the idea? Because if you can store beer in any, in a warm bottle, maybe that's lagering. I don't know.
Dave B has a question.
So if somebody is an ale brewer, what do they need to know about brewing a lager? We just, had an hour and a half of talk, but what are the essential things somebody needs to know if they're going to lagers from brewing ales?
Pitch more yeast.
Just do 2 dry packs of 3470.
Yeah,
maybe
keep it really simple.
I'd known it was that simple. Gosh,
Yeah, I don't think that, honestly, Dave, I don't think there's that much difference. I think it's just,
I think there's a little bit of patience, right? Like it's not like when you do an ale, it's done in like 3 days and you're fine. But with a lager, it's going to be a lot longer.
yeah, yes, that's probably the biggest difference. That and just ensuring that you have proper temperature control. And, if you want it to turn out really well, I think you need to kind of be sensitive to temperature changes and pitch rates and the quality of the malt and the quality of the hops, how you're transferring. When they're at their best, they're really subtle, wonderful beers. And you can't be too clumsy if you want to make a great one. But if you want to make a beer that's drinkable, just do what you're doing with ale, but ferment at a cooler temperature with a different yeast.
Yeah.
So basically, everything you've done, you've learned about quality process. You just make sure you're doing that. Process matters even more because you
Yeah,
can't.
I agree, and I think it can make you a better brewer to brew lagers because it can force you to be like really precise about your temperature control and your yeast handling practices and your oxygenation as well.
All right, thanks.
All right. So how many of you have brewed the one true lager, the Baltic Porter?
I have. Wasn't
I
that
brewed that. We
Clone
did that
comp?
as the club clone comp like 4 years ago, maybe.
Yeah,
And
except
it was-
no one actually came close to what they brought.
Well, because their recipe they gave us had like a pound of chocolate malt or something fucking ridiculous in that, if I recall correctly.
Also, well, it did, but also we brewed that batch like everyone brewed it a month away from the competition, and they brought like a 5-year-old bottle of it to compare.
I have a Baltic Porter lagering right now.
The
Tell us about
Baltic
it.
Porter, the Javits Porter, is what I've mixed my porter off of. It takes some time for it to mellow out, and it's definitely dehusk of the dark grains. Definitely adds a lot of value to it. The doing a slow ramp down for chilling. So if you have a chest freezer with the temperature controller, to be able to ramp down a couple of degrees, every so many days, to get it to temperature, it can be beneficial. To help it to lager to temperature, but that means that you need to not use your chest freezer for the rest of your beer that you have. So if you have another fridge to be able to put your stuff in, then it helps.
Yeah,
How
that's
big
what
of a starter?
with, like it hit final gravity, but it still just, it was still really, really green. So I just slowly ramped it down. I'm just going to lager it for 8 weeks and hopefully that cleans everything up.
Hey, John, how big of a starter do you use for yours?
I'd have to look back at the notes, but it's for a lager, it's pretty big. Yeah. So what I'll do is that I'll make up some wort, and then I'll actually can some wort. So I'll use my kegels to be able to can wort into quarts, and basically I put it into the fridge, extra protection. And basically I pop the tops off to be able to provide some extra sugar for the cells to be able to grow, to propagate the yeast cells every 2 days or so, something like that, to be able to try and grow the cells up to the appropriate level that they need to be. It takes some time. So basically trying to prep at least a week ahead for at least the 10-gallon batch.
Phil mentioned that the Germans turned these around in like 2 weeks, which makes me wonder then, how important is the lagering step? I thought the whole idea of a lager was you're supposed to then keep them cold for weeks or months before you actually drink them. Phil has bailed on us, so I guess wrong time to ask.
I've never done the quick lager, so I really can't speak to that. I've always had enough patience to let it go a long time.
I know nothing else but a slow lager, unfortunately.
I usually do the quick lager.
Right, Garrett, you do quick lager, you said?
Yeah, but I'm by no means a lager expert. There's a reason I'm not on this panel.
I prefer ale yeast. So doing a lager is more of a challenge and less frequently done in this household.
I guess a kind of a take on that question though is, what is lagering? What is the purpose of lagering? Because I think I was maybe misunderstood early on about lagering will like clean up your beer, quote unquote. But the yeast isn't really active when it's that cold, right? So I'm kind of dubious of like, can lagering like clean up diacetyl, for example, when it's at like 33 degrees? Or is it more just about like letting the beer kind of letting the flavors kind of meld and mellow out? Phil?
So it's about a matter of it chilling, and then also about it warming. So about it warming is actually going to let off some of that diacetyl, and then it's about chilling it. So that's where the ramp profile overall, as you're going down and then coming back up to try to relieve some of that additional relief to the beer.
Yeah, because I think lagering will clean up, won't clean up the diacetyl, but will the acetaldehyde. Because I remember last summer I went to Minnesota, and like the Twin Cities area, every brewery either has a cream ale or they have some type of Keller beer. And every brewery I went to that had a Keller beer, all I could taste was just green apple, where they just weren't lagering that beer for long enough. So I think the lagering will get rid of that, just giving it that time. But for the diacetyl, you really got to give it a good diacetyl rest.
So, I mean, to the lager experts, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but always my general understanding has been that the lager yeast itself is just very low ester output. So the yeast is doing basically nothing but fermenting the beer. Like even less esters than you would get from a Chico yeast or something like that. The diacetyl rest is really just there to clean up any of those off flavors that might happen. And then the lagering period is, well, you've already got very low ester content. You're just letting literally everything settle out of the beer. The only thing you have left at the end is the liquid, and all of the solids that might be free floating in an ale that you don't let sit cold long enough are gone. You just have this pure beer left over. So that's the cold conditioning, is really just letting everything drop out. That's why you have the horizontal tanks, because it's less feet, that like the things behind me right here. It's less depth for the solids to have to drop out of, so it takes less time the shorter tank you have.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I think if you pitch enough yeast and everything, by the time you're cold crashing it, like it's not going to taste that much different if you lager it for a month or whatever. I think it'll just be clearer, and maybe the flavors will meld a little bit, but I don't know. Like I said, I haven't really experimented with quick lagering, so it would be an interesting thing to do, is like, brew a lager the normal wet way and then compare it to the same recipe brewed with a quick lager way.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was coming from, going with like the quick lager method with what I do. Like if I have the appropriate pitch rate, the appropriate oxygenation, it doesn't really matter how fast it ferments, so long as I leave it hot enough, long enough to clean up any of the off flavors that happen. It's really that cold side that matters. And like the cold side isn't included in the quick lager. It's like everything about the quick lager method is the fermentation, the hot side, or not the hot side, but the fermentation side. So like, for anyone that doesn't know the quick lager method, it's normally at 50% attenuation, you bump it from the initial fermentation temperature up to around 58 to 60 degrees. At 75% attenuation, you bump it up to like 65-ish degrees, and then you kind of leave it kind of free rising in the high 60s for its diacetyl rest until it's terminal, and then you crash it.
Yeah, and I think they use gelatin or something as well at that point, don't they?
Sometimes. I never do that, because I always just see it as like the terminal fermentation. I'm done with the quick lager method. I'll rack it to kegs, and I'll just let it lager in kegs for as long as I want.
I mean, like I think like storing, even if you store like ales, and if you have an ale and whatever it might be, some sort of pale ale, whatever, on tap for a while, and it's sitting in your keezer, over time, like the flavors kind of clean up, or they change, and like I think for a pale ale, that change we perceive as being bad because you're losing those yeast esters, those hop flavors, etc. But for a lager, that is preferable. Like you want to lose those flavors and get down to, as I think Ramsey was saying, like just Ian, like just the clean beer, like the malt and all that. So like I don't think there's anything unique going on there.
Yeah. I mean, these beers are supposed to be like really crystal clear, except for the Keller beer. So I think the lagering phase does help with that for sure.
Phil, you had bailed out right before my question, which was if the Germans do turn around their lagers in 2 weeks, then how important really is the lagering phase? And that's what this has all been about.
Yeah, I mean, I think Garrett nailed it. Like it's not about transforming the beer in terms of flavor, with the exception of removing the yeast and any other particulates that are in suspension, because those do add flavors. Like go taste your lager when it's still all cloudy. It's going to taste way different after it's clarified. And exactly right. Like Garrett's background, those horizontal lagering tanks are engineered for that purpose, to have a shorter path to sedimentation, so that majority of the beer is clarified. I gotta go, y'all. Thank you for hanging out. I gotta
All
go.
right.
See you, Phil.
Bye.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. So is there any other lager questions before we kill recording and move on to general drinking?